Hello and welcome to U.S. Mortality Trends through the pandemic. This is the eighth and final portion of this series, which is on external causes of death. So that's homicide, suicide, and accidental causes of death. Now, I just updated this with data as of May 2023. But the issue with external causes of death is that they are censored for 6 months, and this has to do with, well, these tend to be the kinds of causes of death where the intent is in question. So think in terms of, say, suicide or, well, accidental causes of death. Was it intentional or accidental, say, as with a drug overdose? I don't want to wait until July, which is when it's mostly completed data. I will be doing future videos on updates to external causes of death, but that will be, separate updates and new graphs and that kind of thing. I had done this presentation as a presentation to the Iowa actuaries, and I've just been updating data as it's been coming in. So you'll see that update through May 2023. So I'm definitely missing November and December data, but the October data can be a little iffy as well. So we're going to start with homicide. So let's take a look here. The 2018 and 2019 graphs are, pretty on top of each other. You can see the peak for death rate. And another thing to note, compared to the physiological causes of death, and this is where things are going to start to change over. My vertical scales, you'll notice the numbers are a lot lower for homicide than they are for a lot of the physiological causes of death, like heart disease and cancer I had showed you. This is not a very common cause of death throughout the entire population. And these are now linear scales, not logarithmic scales. There will be one of these external causes of death where I'm going to switch back to a logarithmic, and I'll note it when we see it. So when we look at where the peak is for homicide, it's at age 20 to 24, and then you can see it kind of peters off. So this is, unsurprising. And, I didn't do a by sex split out, but of course, most homicide deaths are of males, not females. There was a very large jump up, and these are completed statistics for 2020 and 2021. During the pandemic, we can see there was a noticeable jump up in homicide deaths. And you can see this, and we'll see in the next slide the percentage change, but very noticeable. When we look at 2022, you can see, the 2022 curve is very similar to 2018 and 2019. However, I'm missing 2 months of data. To be sure, a lot of homicides, and I'm not showing you the month-to-month pattern, a lot of them are in the summer when tempers are high. Yeah, there's a lot of interpersonal beefs. A lot of the people involved in homicides know each other. It's not stranger danger, as it were, in many of these cases. Yeah, I am expecting that number for 2022 to go up, but not necessarily be as high as 2020 or 2021. So let's take a look at what those percentage changes were by age. Yeah, those were pretty substantial, and you'll notice I don't have any bars for 2022. I did not feel like making a comparison with partial year changes. Once I get to the July numbers update, I'll probably redo these, but I'm going to be looking at some other graphs in future videos. I'm just going to stick to 2020 and 2021 because I have complete data for those years. So you can see, starting with age 10 to 14, and I actually am showing, unlike the physiological causes of death, the entire spectrum of ages. So we had an over 50% increase in homicide. Now, again, if you remember from the prior graph, the homicide rate for 10 to 14-year-olds is very low. So a 50% increase doesn't take a lot of deaths to get that high. But our peak, remember, it was at 20 to 24, and that was over a 30% increase. The increase, and remember, this is comparing against 2019. So both 2020 and 2021 overall was about a 35% increase compared to 2019 in terms of homicide deaths. And you can see by age group how that increase was. And it was a bit worse in 2021 versus 2020. And we can see it's, over a lot of adult ages. It tends to be young adults to middle age where we're seeing most of the change. Okay, so there's a variety of reasons for this going on. Okay, some of it could be related to the depolicing movement that was occurring. It's not directly related to the pandemic. COVID is not necessarily causing this. As policing comes back online to normal levels, one may expect the homicide rates to come down. Some of the things, of course, was people were being released from jail during 2020 because of COVID going through various institutions, and you did not want to be locked up with people during an airborne pandemic. So that could be related. Not everybody has the same propensity to homicide. So that is always something to keep in mind. I'm sorry, I didn't update the numbers down here. It says as of 16 March because these were the finalized 2020 and 2021. I didn't have to update them. They didn't change. These were already completed years. So that's homicide. And it went up by quite a lot. This may not match crime statistics from the FBI, by the way, because this comes from data on death certificates that has a different level of evidence versus legal definition of homicide. So actually what the code is for this, by the way, is assault. I call it homicide because, that's what people would know it as. So the ICD-10 code is actually death by assault. And you can get into further detail in terms of method. And I could split out whether guns were used or not. I'm not doing that in this presentation. This is a very high level. A lot of these, of course, do involve guns. So the next one may surprise people because of the assumptions they make. Homicide has a shape in terms of death rates that a lot of people expect, that it's highest in youth. Suicide has a shape different from what a lot of people expect, which is that, yes, it does increase over, teen. So here's 15 to 19. But then, and I did not split it out by sex. And there is a different pattern. If you split it out male and female by age, there is a different pattern of where there is peak suicides for females versus what the pattern is for males. I'm not going to discuss it right now. Let's just discuss the graph that we see in front of us. So let's look at what the pattern is for 2018 and 2019. So that's the yellow and the green. So I'm going to follow that. It's, goes up in teenhood. And I did have all of the ages here, and I'm not going to show them all of the ages on the next graph. But there really isn't any numbers for under age 5, and there's really not much to graph for 5 to 9. But yes, it does start being appreciable at 10 to 14, definitely noticeable at 15 to 19, and it's a very high rank for age 15 to 19 because they're not dying from much. And that's why people notice and assume things about, say, young adulthood with regards to suicide, because not many think, they're not dying from heart attacks as much as, say, a 70 to 74-year-old. However, if you look at what the rates are doing, so I'm going to use this arrow so you can see it, it's actually kind of increasing in the peak. You can see here is at about age 55 to 59, then it comes down. And what's kind of interesting is there's a little bit of a trough around those early retirement years, and then it starts climbing again. Okay, again, there is a difference in this pattern if I split it out by sex. But again, I'm not showing you that right now. So then I did put the 2022 through October, and it does seem to have a similar shape as the 2018 and 2019. So it might be similar to that. But let's look at the 2020 and the 2021 curves. So, they seem, look at here. So the ages, these middle ages where suicide is usually higher, were lower during the pandemic years. Isn't that interesting? However, for the older ages, we can see the suicide rates were higher. So when you may have seen some reportage about suicide during the pandemic, there were differential, and you can see actually, I'm sorry, it was higher for younger ages here. And we'll see this more clearly on the next slide. That maybe overall, whether it was a crude rate or an age-adjusted rate, there, it was hard to interpret what was going on with suicide. It was unlike with homicide, where it definitely went up by 35% for suicide. They're like, it looks like it went down. Well, we can see for those peak years, it did go down for those who are middle-aged. So that was kind of interesting. We weren't expecting that. And, a variety of people had theories of why this was. And it's not necessarily because COVID is killing them. I mean, these are, age 50 to 54, 55 to 59. It's not like, okay, I was going to die by suicide, but COVID killed me instead. It can be other things going on here. So the dynamics there are interesting. So some interesting things to dig into. And I really, again, once I get more complete data for 2022, and I really do want to split this out by sex, because the dynamics by sex and age are very different. Okay, so here we go. This is better, and I do start it at 10 to 14 years old because under age 10, it's not appreciable. I want you to look at these percentages because where we saw for some of the other causes of death where they're going 50% above and that kind of thing, this is a little more muted compared to some of those other causes of death. But again, note where we had our peak in terms of rate for death by suicide, they had a 15% drop, again, compared to 2019. So that's, intriguing. Those peak years, we saw a decrease in death by suicide. For younger adults, we saw increases, not good. And for older ages, we saw increases. So maybe for these older ages, you had loneliness, with lockdown, not being able to see friends. And on the older ages, perhaps people they knew were dying of COVID. So, there's issues on the young ages and the very old ages, but in that middle age, the suicide rates actually drop down. So that's an intriguing trajectory, not expected. I will want to dig into this further. So that is kind of interesting. But the next set is the stuff I really want to look at, and that's accidents. This one, you'll see I went back to the logarithmic scale, and accidents as a cause of death, as a rankable cause of death, always annoys me because it's got so much disparate things in here. It's got motor vehicle accidents. Okay, you think, okay, that's accidents. It's got drowning. Okay, that's accidental. It's got falls and nature of falls. We'll think about that in a moment. And it's got accidental drug overdoses. And you're starting to think, yeah, these have different aspects to them. We probably want to disaggregate, and I definitely want to disaggregate some of these causes because drug overdoses are very key on their own. So are motor vehicle accidents, and so are falls for the elderly because of what falls mean for the elderly versus dying by a fall when you're in your 20s and you get drunk and, hey, hold my beer, watch this. Those all mean different things. But it's kind of interesting for accidental causes of death, what the nature of the accidents differ by age range. You can see this is just kind of flat across here. What's in here versus what's going on at the older ages? What are these accidents for each of these? So we really need to disaggregate them. And if I don't disaggregate them and just say accidents, we can see it went up by a lot. It went up, in 2020 and up by even more in 2021. So what's inside there that's driving these increases across the board? And you can see I have all age groups. It actually went down for infants and some of the small children and a little bit for elderly in 2020. And so why did that go down? But it's kind of up across the board for 2021. And it is, again, the nature of the accidents that kill for different age groups pre-pandemic or in 2019, and then what happened to those causes in 2020, and then what was the dynamics in 2021. So I will disaggregate, so let's get into that. So the first one I looked at was falls. And again, I have that logarithmic scale, and you see that death rate due to falls is very much like a physiological cause of death. And you might be like, what is that about? And what that can be is, yeah, there are accidental causes of death, but it can be a marker of frailty. I've often mentioned to people that it is an indicator. If you have I'll just say grandparent, though all my grandparents are dead now, but an elderly relative who has a fall from standing from level ground, like no steps, nothing like that involved, and they break a hip. And sometimes it's hard to tell which came first. Did the hip break and therefore they fall, or did they fall and that caused the hip to break? Sometimes it's not clear. But that's actually something that can kill, especially and in increasing amounts at older ages. But it's an indication of frailty. And I have told people, especially for older relatives, that's a sign you better visit them. Absolutely, because it's an indication of frailty. When we look at the falls, and I started this one at 30 to 34, it went up in 2020, and let's look at the scale. I'm not quite sure exactly what's going on with this 40 to 44-year-olds. Let's go back. It's not a high rate here, but my guess would be, so for younger ages, it's almost always alcohol involved because there's different codes for falls. It's like falling from 2 stories. And this is supposed to be accidental, not suicide, but sometimes it's not clear if it's intentional or not. That said, at younger ages, dying from a fall usually means you fell from somewhere very high. At older ages, it's usually from level ground, and it's indication of frailty. And yes, there are different codes from you're standing on level ground and you fall and you die versus from a great height. There are different codes. So this is a huge category, and you can see I'm back to the linear scale, and now you can see where some of that level, and it's not exactly level, so it's relatively level and low for children for motor vehicle accident deaths because they're passengers. Once you become a driver, Well, you can see it kind of ramps up with a peak at age 20 to 24, and that's when the drivers who are dying in motor vehicle accidents. It comes down with experience and not driving drunk, and then is level for a while, and then the elderly. And it's not just that they're not able to drive properly in old age, it's also that they're not able to survive a crash very well. So, a crash at a low speed, say, and you're 30 years old, you can go to the hospital, get fixed up, and you're fine. But at age 80, perhaps, you're not likely to survive as well. And so now you can see this gets into a frailty curve kind of situation once we're getting into the elderly ages for motor vehicle accident deaths. Let's look at these curves before we look at the percentage changes. Again, the yellow and the green, they're doing their normal noisy thing, going up and down. But we can see in 2020, the death rates did jump up for younger ages and actually came down for older ages. And then for 2021, we see that it again went up even further for younger ages. And then for older ages, that's about the same level as it was before. For 2022, again, it's only through October, so we're missing 2 months. It looks like we still have something of a bad year. And if you have been trying to price auto insurance, I mean, it's not just motor vehicle accident deaths that are driving it, it's also inflation in terms of if you have auto damage and, they have to pay for that. That's rising, and so that's driving the insurance rates. But you can see that, I mean, there's really bad experience. And this is just the death side. I'm not even getting into how many accidents there are. So let's get into these percentages and we can see. So 2020, those are pretty bad for the younger ages. And you can see it's negative for the old people. We've got lockdowns. The old people weren't going anywhere. The younger people were your DoorDash drivers and that kind of thing, and those people who were on the roads were driving like maniacs. And it was even worse in 2021, but we can see the older people, lockdowns were coming up, they were getting back on the roads, and they were getting, pancaked by the maniac drivers themselves. So that wasn't too great. Yeah, you can see the 30 to 34-year-olds, it's getting close to a 40% increase compared to 2019. This is not good, obviously. You can see for children in 2020, again, during lockdowns, they weren't being taken anywhere, so they were dying less in motor vehicle accidents. So, that's what you can see. Isn't that kind of interesting to see the pattern here? And then it will be interesting to see where 2022 lands, if it's kind of closer to 2020, and how long it's going to take to get closer, to where 2019 had been. The very long-term trend for motor vehicle accident deaths, I hadn't split that out. It had been, if I go back decades, motor vehicle accident deaths on an age-adjusted basis had been coming down due to safety features in vehicles and also enforcement of drunk driving laws, seatbelt laws, and that kind of thing. And that really helped bring down motor vehicle accident deaths. But, during the pandemic, it got worse. And so here's the really bad one. Unintentional drug overdoses. So these are not, they actually have homicides too, but okay, so unintentional drug and suicides, but these are the accidental drug ODs. Remember, there was a bad trend before the pandemic with drug overdoses. First, we had the OxyContin thing in the early 2000s, and then kind of mid-2010s, fentanyl took off and there was a bend in the curve for drug ODs. And now it's gotten even worse. So we can see 2018 and 2019 here. And the peak of drug ODs is kind of, here in the early 30s for death. It's not necessarily this is where the usage is highest. It might be this is where you're more likely to not be able to survive when you OD. So you can see there was a jump up in 2020, and it was even higher in 2021. The 2022 through October is kind of matching the 2020 curve. So if I put in 2 more months, I'm thinking it's going to be somewhere between 2020 and the 2021 curve, or it might be as bad as the 2021 curve. So this is not a good trend. Yeah, I start the horizontal at the 15 to 19 years old. This is over 100% increase. Of course, they had a lower death rate than older ages. So let's go to like peak usage and death rates, and that's in the 30s to 40s. An increase, over 60% for 40 to 44 years old in 2021. This is pretty bad. The rates were not as high for your base rate for 65 to 69, but these are huge percentage increases. This has really hit populations hard. And even with COVID going away, we are expecting these drug OD trends to continue. It was bad before COVID, and a lot of communities have been having issues with drug ODs. Um, a lot of them, it's just difficult to know how to deal with this. Fentanyl has been getting into the illicit drug supply. There are illicit uses of fentanyl. It was used for my colonoscopy as an anesthesia. It in regular pharmaceutical amounts, which are really, really tiny compared to what's getting mixed in with opioids in general. And people are not necessarily expecting in their marijuana or whatever it is that they are consuming to get fentanyl necessarily, though some are, of course. People have assumed that, and I'm going to go back to the prior graph, people have assumed that this relates to people getting surgery and then getting hooked on prescription medications and then switching over to illicit drugs. And that can be the pathway, and that's one of the pathways to opioids, of course. But some people just, recreationally use opioids and end up ODing on them because I know people who have died that way in my own neighborhood. It's at all levels. You go to the Society of Actuaries has a dashboard of mortality, and I will demonstrate this in a future video. This is just the Iowa Actuaries presentation I did, and so I'm just focusing on these graphs. But they have it by socioeconomic quintile that they've done for county levels in the United States, and for the opioid death rates, accidental drug ODs, it's at every socioeconomic quintile, and there's some differences, and there did seem to be some separation during the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, it was a problem at all levels. A lot of people assume things about the drug overdose situation, but I think they're using information from 20 years ago to make their assumptions, and it's gotten a lot more intense during the pandemic. Whether it will be handled, as I said, once the COVID pandemic is over and now it's endemic, we will see. It's a difficult situation, and sometimes there are no good choices, and there's no great way to control it. It's the drug problem. You can think back historically to the opium wars and all sorts of drug-related problems throughout history, and often it's one drug problem in a society gets replaced with a different drug problem. So that's my happy story, where I end. In the presentation, I have links to all the spreadsheets and data and all of that. So, you can download these for your own edification. And I'll have future videos that are separate of these slides. But that's been the series. I hope you've enjoyed it. And there'll be more mortality with me later.